It started in the heart of America. A mother, 4 sons, and a man with a mind for crime. In the 1930s, when the country was broke and desperate, they built an empire out of fear. They robbed banks, kidnapped millionaires, and crossed more state lines than the law could count. To the press, they were folk heroes. To the FBI, they were public enemies. To each other, they were family, loyal, reckless, and doomed. At the center of it all was Alvin "Creepy" Karpis, a quiet man with sharp eyes and a colder heart. Beside him, Fred and Doc Barker, brothers born into poverty and shaped by violence. And behind them, their mother, Kate "Ma" Barker, a woman who would die branded as America's most dangerous woman. This story is not about glamour. It's about a time when crime was survival and loyalty came with a price. It's the rise and fall of the last great outlaw gang of the Depression. This is the story of the Bremer Karpis Gang. It began in the small town of Ash Grove, Missouri. Arizona Donnie Clark was born there in 1873. A woman who would one day be known by another name, one that echoed through FBI files and newspaper headlines: Ma Barker. In 1892, she married George Elias Barker, a working man who never seemed to stay long in one place or one job. He took whatever work he could find: farming, water delivery, station maintenance. The couple had 4 sons: Herman in 1893, Lloyd in 1897, Arthur in 1899, and Fred in 1901. The Barkers were poor, often moving from one rented house to another. By 1910, they had settled in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a city growing fast, filled with oil workers, gamblers, and grifters. There wasn't much structure in the Barker household. The FBI would later describe George as shiftless, and the boys as more or less illiterate. Arizona, Ari, to her friends, was fiercely protective of her sons. Every arrest, every accusation was met with the same line: "My poor innocent boy." But innocence was never part of the Barker story. By their teenage years, the boys had already found trouble. Herman, the oldest, was arrested for highway robbery in 1910. A few years later, he and his brother Lloyd were running with a local outfit known as the Central Park Gang, a small-time Tulsa crew that dealt in bootlegging, car theft, and burglary. It was here the Barker boys learned the language of crime and met men who'd later become part of their future gang. Arthur, the 3rd son, would earn the nickname Doc. It wasn't for medicine. In 1918, he was caught stealing cars and later arrested again for attempted bank robbery in Muskogee. By 1922, he was in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary for the murder of a night watchman named Thomas J. Sherrill. Lloyd, meanwhile, was convicted of robbing mail at Baxter Springs, Kansas, and sent to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Fred, the youngest, followed the same road. In 1926, he robbed a bank in Winfield, Kansas, and was sent to the Kansas State Penitentiary. By the end of the 1920s, every Barker son was either behind bars or dead. Herman, the oldest and wildest, went out in a blaze. In August 1927, after killing a sheriff's deputy in Wyoming, he was cornered in Wichita. Wounded and out of options, he turned the gun on himself. George Barker left soon after. Some said he couldn't take the shame. Others claimed Arizona drove him away with her temper and her loyalty to the boys. By 1930, she was alone, living in a shack with dirt floors, her sons scattered between prisons and graves. But something in her hardened. The woman who once cried for her innocent boys began to see them differently. They were her only way out, her family, her protection, and her income. In that cold Oklahoma dust, the seeds of the Bremer Karpis Gang were waiting to grow. Fred Barker was the youngest of the Barker boys, but by the time he hit his mid-20s, he had already built a name in prison yards and police reports. He wasn't clever like some crooks of the time. He was bold, reckless, and loyal to no one but his own blood. In 1926, a burglary in Kansas sent him to the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. That's where he met another inmate, a thin, sharp-eyed Canadian named Alvin Karpis. Born Alvin Karpavicius in Montreal in 1907, Karpis had grown up in Kansas, the son of Lithuanian immigrants. By 16, he was already working with bootleggers and pimps, drifting between small jobs and small crimes. The two men were different. Fred was impulsive, Karpis was patient. But in prison, they became allies. Karpis later said Fred had charm, the kind that got him favors behind bars, and a mean streak that came out when anyone crossed him. To Karpis, Fred wasn't the brains. He was the muscle, and that was fine. Karpis could handle the thinking. Fred was released in 1931. He went home to Oklahoma, where his mother, Arizona Ma Barker, was living with a jobless drifter named Arthur Dunlop. The house was poor, the air was thick with anger, and Fred was already talking about getting back into the game. When Karpis got out a few months later, he joined him. They started small burglaries, stolen cars, quick money jobs. But that same year, everything changed. On November 8, 1931, Fred Barker, Karpis, and an accomplice named William Weaver were driving through Pocahontas, Arkansas, looking for a place to rob. When the local night marshal, Manley Jackson, tried to write down their license plate, Fred pulled a .45 and shot him in the back. A week later, they hit a store in West Plains, Missouri. The town's sheriff, C. Roy Kelly, tried to stop them. Karpis and Barker killed him too. Those murders put them on the run. The pair fled south, then north, finally reaching St. Paul, Minnesota, a city known at the time as a safe haven for wanted men. The corrupt chief of police, Thomas Big Tom Brown, had a reputation for turning a blind eye as long as the money was good. Under his protection, Barker and Karpis rented a small house on Robert Street, pretending to be musicians. It didn't last long. Their landlord's son recognized their faces in True Detective magazine and called the police. But St. Paul's cops were already bought. Brown tipped them off, and the Barkers vanished before anyone could make an arrest. By then, their reputation was growing. So was their ambition. When Arthur Doc Barker got paroled in 1932 after serving time for murder, he joined his brother and Karpis. The trio began to build something bigger, a rotating crew of thieves, bank robbers, and killers. Among them were names that would later show up in headlines: Fred Gertz, Volney Davis, and Harry Campbell. In the back rooms of St. Paul's speakeasies, their next chapter was already being written, one that would turn a family of outlaws into one of the most wanted gangs in America. By 1931, St. Paul, Minnesota wasn't just another Midwestern city, it was a criminal sanctuary. Bank robbers, bootleggers, and killers could live there under one condition: keep the peace inside city limits and pay the police their cut. For men like Fred Barker and Alvin Karpis, it was the perfect setup. They rented a modest house at 1031 South Robert Street, posing as traveling musicians under the name Anderson. Their neighbors saw them as quiet men with a fondness for late nights. In truth, they were planning jobs across the Midwest, robberies that would bankroll a new kind of operation. Fred's brother Arthur Doc Barker joined soon after his parole from the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He'd served time for killing a night watchman back in 1921. By the time he got out, prison had hardened him. He was colder now, less impulsive than Fred, but every bit as dangerous. The three men, Fred, Doc, and Karpis, became the backbone of what was now called the Karpis Gang. Around them revolved a shifting crew of outlaws: Volney Davis, a Tulsa gunman, an old friend from the Central Park Gang; Lawrence Duvall, a violent killer with a long trail of dead officers behind him; Fred Gertz, also known as Shotgun George Ziegler, with ties to Chicago's outfit; and Harry Sawyer, a St. Paul racketeer who could buy police protection with a single phone call. Their early work was fast and brutal. On June 17, 1932, the gang robbed the Fort Scott Bank in Kansas. A month later, on July 26th, they hit the Cloud County Bank in Concordia, Kansas, taking around $250,000 in cash and bonds. By August 18th, they'd moved north, robbing the Second National Bank of Beloit, Wisconsin, for another $50,000. Each job pulled them deeper into violence. On December 16, 1932, the gang stormed the Third Northwestern National Bank in Minneapolis. During the getaway, two policemen, Ira Leon Evans and Leo Gorski were killed. A civilian died too, caught in the crossfire. It was chaos wrapped in precision. They hit hard, moved fast, and vanished before local law enforcement could react. But the body count was rising, and with it came attention. Inside the gang, tensions brewed. Fred Barker's temper clashed with Karpis's methodical approach. Karpis saw himself as the strategist, the one who thought beyond the next robbery. Fred lived for the action. He wanted speed, danger, and easy money. And then something unexpected happened. Fred's mother, Ma Barker, and her boyfriend Arthur Dunlop joined them in St. Paul. She'd been living in poverty in Oklahoma, but with her sons back on the move, she was part of the family again. The gang rented new safe houses under aliases, moving between states, Missouri, Kansas, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Their robberies were bringing in thousands, but their names were starting to spread in every police bulletin between Chicago and Tulsa. By early 1933, they were beginning to see a problem. Robbing banks was getting harder. Security was improving. Response times were faster. Every heist now came with a higher risk of dying in the street, so Karpis started thinking bigger. He wanted crimes that offered more money and less exposure. Something cleaner, if such a thing existed in their world. That's when the Barker-Karpis gang turned to kidnapping. By the spring of 1933, the Barker-Karpis gang had made their mark across the Midwest. Banks were bleeding cash. Police were hunting ghosts, but the walls were closing in. Too many robberies, too many dead men, too much noise. Alvin Karpis knew it couldn't last. He'd started thinking like a businessman, risk versus reward. Robberies were quick money, but they burned bridges fast. Every town they hit became a place they could never go back to. In St. Paul, corruption still ran deep. The city's police chief, Thomas Big Tom Brown, was on the take. For a cut, he offered protection and information. Brown warned the gang that bank jobs were getting riskier and suggested another way to make money: kidnapping. At the time, ransom crimes were becoming the new headline business. The Lindbergh baby kidnapping had shaken the nation, and local crooks had started copying the idea. Karpis saw opportunity. He wasn't interested in small targets. He wanted the kind of men whose families could pay 6 figures without flinching. That summer, the gang started watching William A. Ham Jr., the president of the Theodore Ham Brewing Company in St. Paul. Ham was wealthy, predictable, and unguarded. On June 15, 1933, around noon, Ham stepped out of his office for a short walk. He never made it home. Doc Barker and Charles Fitzgerald grabbed him off the street and pushed him into Karpis's car. They drove him across state lines into Wisconsin, then to a hideout near Bensenville, Illinois. Ham was forced to sign ransom notes, 4 of them demanding $100,000. The exchange went off without interference. The money was dropped. Ham was released near Wyoming, Minnesota 4 days later, shaken but alive. It was, by their standards, perfect, but the perfection didn't last. When the FBI got the ransom notes, their new laboratory found something no gang had planned for: fingerprints invisible to the naked eye. Using a new forensic method called the silver nitrate process, agents treated the notes with a chemical that reacted to the salt left behind by human sweat. The result revealed prints from Alvin Karpis, Doc Barker, and others. It was the first successful use of this technique in FBI history. The Bureau now had hard evidence tying the gang to a major kidnapping. And though Karpis didn't know it yet, this single discovery would mark the beginning of the end. Flush with cash and confidence, the Barker-Karpis gang prepared for another job. This time, they would go after an even bigger prize, one that would make them rich, infamous, and hunted by every lawman in the country. By early 1934, the Barker-Karpis gang was living large off the Ham ransom. They had new cars, new hideouts, and new problems. Every FBI office in the Midwest had their names pinned to the wall. But greed doesn't stop because things get dangerous. It usually grows louder. Alvin Karpis was restless. He wanted another score, something bigger than before. His target this time was Edward George Bremer Jr., the 37-year-old president of the Commercial State Bank of St. Paul and heir to one of the richest families in Minnesota. On January the 17th, 1934, Bremer left his house around 9 a.m. to drive to work. It was cold and clear. A dark sedan suddenly blocked his car at the corner of Lexington Parkway and Goodrich Avenue. Another vehicle pulled in behind him. When Bremer tried to resist, two men yanked open his door and forced him to the floor of their car. He was blindfolded and driven out of the city. The gang moved him first to a rented house near Bensenville, Illinois, the same area they'd used during the ham job. There, Doc Barker, Harry Campbell, and Volney Davis guarded him while Karpis coordinated the ransom. Bremer was ordered to sign ransom notes demanding $200,000, double what they had taken from Ham. Within hours, the FBI was quietly alerted. Bremer's abandoned sedan had been found with traces of blood, making his family fear the worst. His father, Adolf Bremer, was not an ordinary victim's parent. He was a close friend of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. That connection turned the case into national news. Roosevelt mentioned the kidnapping in one of his fireside chats, calling for harsher penalties against gangsters who live by ransom and murder. Despite the attention, the Barker-Karpis gang pushed ahead. The ransom negotiations were managed through coded ads in the Minneapolis Tribune, messages like, "We are ready, Alice." When the money was prepared, it was packed into small denominations, mostly 5s and 10s, marked and recorded by serial number. On February 6, 1934, the exchange took place. Family Representative Walter McGee, following exact instructions, drove toward Rochester, Minnesota. He watched for a series of flashing red lights, then turned down a gravel road. When he saw 5 headlights blink in the dark, he stopped and dropped the ransom bag beside the road. Within minutes, the money was gone. Bremer was released the next day on February 7th, near Rochester, shaken but alive. The operation had been smooth, but it came with a cost. Within weeks, the FBI found an empty gas can near the route used during the exchange. A fingerprint lifted from the can matched Arthur "Doc" Barker. It was the first solid lead, proof connecting the gang to the Bremer case. That single print triggered a national manhunt. Every gang member's name, Fred and Doc Barker, Alvin Karpis, Harry Campbell, Fred Gertz, Russell Gibson, and Volney Davis, was circulated across the country. Karpis had achieved what he wanted: wealth, power, and infamy. But now the Barker-Karpis gang had crossed a line they could never come back from. The Bremer kidnapping didn't just make them rich, it made them public enemies. After the Bremer kidnapping, the Barker-Karpis gang stopped being criminals on the run. They became the nation's most hunted fugitives. The FBI, once a small and cautious agency, was now turning into something different. A force with teeth, driven by politics, media, and a director named J. Edgar Hoover who wanted results. The pressure came fast. Every major city had agents searching for their faces. Every highway patrolman had their names. By late 1934, the gang had splintered. Some went underground, some tried to leave the country. Fred Barker and Harry Campbell fled south, settling under fake names at the El Commodore Hotel in Miami. They weren't alone. Fred's mother, Kate "Ma" Barker, was with them, the same woman the press would later paint as the gang's mastermind. In truth, Ma Barker was no criminal genius. She followed her sons from one hideout to another, cooking meals, writing letters, and keeping the household together. But when Hoover's bureau needed a headline, she became something else: the most dangerous woman in America. In November 1934, Fred asked a hotel manager for a quiet place to rent. The man told him about a lakeside cottage near Ocklawaha, Florida, on Lake Weir. It sounded perfect. They moved in under the name Blackburn and settled into a routine, swimming, fishing, and keeping their heads down. Back in Chicago, Arthur "Doc" Barker wasn't as lucky. On January 8, 1935, agents surrounded his apartment. He was arrested without a fight. Inside the same building, his associate, Russell "Slim Gray" Gibson, tried to shoot it out. He wore a bulletproof vest and carried a machine gun. He didn't make it out alive. When agents searched the apartment, they found weapons, cash, and a map of Florida. On that map, one spot was circled: Lake Weir. The bureau moved fast. A team of agents led by Earl Connolly tracked the location, set up a perimeter, and waited for orders. At dawn on January 16, 1935, they surrounded the house. Connolly called out over a loudspeaker, "Come out with your hands up!" Silence. They waited 15 minutes and tried again. Still no answer. Then a voice shouted from inside, "All right, go ahead!" A burst of automatic gunfire ripped through the upstairs window. The agents returned fire using Thompson's submachine guns and rifles. Tear gas grenades shattered the windows, filling the house with smoke. For 4 hours, the firefight continued. Locals gathered nearby to watch as if it were a spectacle, unaware that 2 people inside were being cut down by hundreds of rounds. By 10:30 a.m., the house went silent. Agents moved in. Inside the upstairs bedroom, they found Fred Barker and Ma Barker lying dead, surrounded by weapons. Between them was a Thompson submachine gun. Fred's body was riddled with bullets. Ma had one fatal wound. The Bureau called it a triumph, proof that Hoover's new FBI could outshoot America's worst criminals. But many who knew the Barkers said something else, that the Bureau had killed an unarmed mother to make a point. Either way, the message was clear. The Barker era was over. The surviving members scattered. Volney Davis and Harry Campbell disappeared into the underworld. Alvin Karpis, the last man standing, went into hiding. He'd soon inherit a new title from the FBI, one that no man before him had lived to keep. After the smoke cleared in Florida, the Barker brothers were gone. Ma was gone. But Alvin "Creepy" Karpis, the quiet strategist, the man who planned every score, was still out there. He was the last survivor of the Barker-Karpis gang, and the FBI wanted him more than anyone else in America. Karpis had been on the run since 1934. He'd changed hideouts constantly: Chicago, Kansas City, Hot Springs, Atlantic City, even Cuba for a time. He'd undergone plastic surgery, an illegal operation performed by the same underworld doctor who'd worked on the Barkers, Joseph Moran. The surgery was crude and painful, meant to alter his face and remove his fingerprints. It didn't work. Moran later disappeared, his body believed to have been dumped into Lake Erie. Despite the pressure, Karpis didn't stop. In April 1935, he led an armored car robbery, and that October, he helped rob a mail train in Garrettsville, Ohio, taking tens of thousands in cash and securities. He was building a new crew, smaller but ruthless, including Fred Hunter, a career criminal from the South. By the spring of 1936, the FBI had killed or captured almost every major outlaw of the Depression era. John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson were all dead. When Nelson fell in November 1934, the Bureau gave Karpis a title no one before him had survived to carry: Public Enemy Number 1. The Bureau's director, J. Edgar Hoover, was under pressure from Congress. Senator Kenneth McKellar had mocked him during a hearing, saying the director had never personally arrested anyone. Hoover didn't forget that. He made a promise to himself: the next big arrest would be his. That chance came in New Orleans the following May. FBI agents had traced Karpis to an apartment on Canal Street, where he was hiding with Fred Hunter and another associate. They watched the building for days, waiting. On May 1st, 1936, just after 5 p.m., Karpis and his men stepped out and climbed into a Plymouth coupe. When Hoover gave the signal, a dozen agents moved in. The car was boxed in within seconds, guns drawn. Accounts differ on what happened next. The official FBI version claimed Hoover personally reached into the car and grabbed Karpis before he could reach for a rifle. But Karpis later said Hoover didn't show up until it was already over, that he stepped out of another car only after his agents had done the work. There was even one embarrassing detail both sides agreed on: no one had brought handcuffs. So the Bureau's top agents tied up America's public enemy number 1 with a necktie. For Hoover, it didn't matter. The photo op was perfect. He stood in front of Karpis, calm and triumphant, the press flashing cameras around them. Within hours, the headlines read, "Hoover captures Karpis, public enemy number 1 taken alive." Karpis was flown back to St. Paul and charged with the Ham kidnapping. He pled guilty and received a life sentence. The capture marked the end of an era, the final chapter of the Depression's great outlaw years. The days of machine gun robbers and roadside ambushes were finished. The FBI had won its war, and Hoover's legend was sealed. For Karpis, it was the beginning of a different kind of story, one that would stretch across prison walls, out to Alcatraz, and into the quiet corners of history. When Alvin Karpis stepped off the plane in St. Paul, the war between gangsters and the government was over. He was the last big outlaw of the Depression era, the only one of the FBI's 4 public enemies #1 to be taken alive. The others, Dillinger, Floyd, and Nelson, were already in the ground. The trial came quickly. Karpis first pled not guilty to the Ham kidnapping, but within weeks he changed course. His lawyer, Thomas J. Newman, told the court his client would accept responsibility for the crime that had made him infamous. He later offered another plea, guilty to the Bremer conspiracy, in exchange for dropping the second kidnapping charge. The court agreed. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in federal custody. In August 1936, Karpis was shipped off to the government's new high-security prison, Alcatraz. At that time, the island was still fresh and feared, a rocky fortress designed to hold men who refused to break anywhere else. Karpis was given prisoner number 325 AZ. He kept mostly to himself. He was smart, organized, and quiet, qualities that earned him a strange kind of respect inside those concrete walls. But he wasn't a model inmate. He got into fights, broke rules, and refused to be intimidated. For years, he worked in the prison bakery. He'd wake before dawn, mix dough, and watch the fog roll over the bay through barred windows. Among the guards, he was known as polite but unpredictable, a man who could hold a conversation about books one minute and fight over a misplaced tray the next. He stayed on that island longer than anyone else. 26 years, the longest continuous sentence served by any inmate at Alcatraz. In 1958, he was transferred briefly to Leavenworth, then sent back to Alcatraz 6 months later. In 1962, when the government decided to close the prison, Karpis was moved to McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington state. That's where he met a young inmate with a guitar, a quiet, manipulative kid named Charles Manson. Manson called himself Little Charlie. He'd been in and out of reformatories his whole life and wanted to learn music. Karpis agreed to teach him guitar. He later said Manson was lazy and shiftless, but quick to manipulate others. "I did feel used," Karpis wrote years later, under circumstances where it hadn't been necessary. By the late 1960s, the world outside had changed. The Depression was history. The names that once filled front pages, Barker, Dillinger, Karpis, had faded into myth. In 1969, after 33 years behind bars, Alvin Karpis was paroled. He was deported to Canada, the country of his birth, but struggled to prove his citizenship. His fingerprints had been surgically removed decades earlier, and the bureaucracy didn't know what to do with a man who literally had no identity. He eventually settled in Montreal, living quietly under supervision. The man who once robbed banks with a Tommy gun now spent his days walking city streets, smoking cigarettes, and reading newspapers that no longer had any reason to print his name. But his story wasn't over yet. When Alvin Karpis walked out of prison in 1969, he was 62 years old. The world he returned to didn't look like the one he'd left behind. There were no getaway cars, no machine guns, no newspaper headlines screaming his name. He was an old outlaw in an era that had forgotten what one looked like. After his release, he was deported to Canada, the country of his birth, but even that didn't come easy. His fingerprints had been surgically removed in 1934 by underworld Dr. Joseph Moran, and without them, proving his identity took months. Eventually, Canadian officials accepted him. He settled in Montreal, quiet and polite, almost invisible. For the first time in his life, Karpis lived legally. He paid rent, bought groceries, went out for walks. Occasionally, a reporter or crime writer tracked him down, asking about the Barker days. He'd smile thinly and give them what they wanted, stories about Fred Barker, about Hoover, about Alcatraz, but there was a bitterness under his calm. He knew the myths that had been written, how the Bureau had painted Barker as a criminal mastermind, how Hoover's version of events became gospel. Karpis never forgave that. In 1971, he published his first autobiography, The Alvin Karpis Story, through McClelland and Stewart. The book sold modestly, but it brought him back into the public eye. On a Canadian book tour, people were surprised. The man they'd seen in FBI posters looked more like an accountant than a gangster. He joked about it. When his publisher's assistant stopped at a bank during the tour, Karpis smiled and said, "You go ahead, dear. You take care of the vault, I'll drive." He lived that way for a few years, quiet, self-aware, sometimes lonely. By 1973, he moved to Spain, settling in the coastal city of Malaga. The Mediterranean suited him. He'd sit in cafes, talk to locals, and enjoy the kind of peace no outlaw ever expected to find. In 1979, he completed his second book, On the Rock, co-written with journalist Robert Livesey. It was his final account, a mix of reflection and regret, written by a man who'd lived through both the violence and the silence that followed. On August 26, 1979, Alvin Karpis was found dead in his apartment. Sleeping pills were beside the bed. The authorities ruled it a suicide, but those who knew him disagreed. Robert Livesey said Karpis had been in good spirits, waiting for his new book to be released. He wasn't the type to kill himself, Livesey said later. He was a survivor. The Spanish coroner eventually changed the report to death by natural causes. No autopsy was performed. He was buried the next day in San Miguel Cemetery, Malaga, Spain. The man once called Creepy had lived to be 71, the longest-lived of the Great Depression-era outlaws. When the dirt settled over his grave, one era ended for good. The gunfire of the 1930s was gone. The legends faded into dust, and all that remained were the files, photographs, reports, and fingerprints on old ransom notes, proof of a time when America's most wanted were more myth than man. By the time Alvin Karpis was buried in Spain, the story of the Bremer Karpis Gang had become part of American folklore, a violent echo from the Great Depression, when small towns had banks, highways were new, and outlaws became household names. Between 1931 and 1935, the Barker brothers and Karpis built one of the longest-running criminal enterprises of their time. They robbed banks across Kansas, Missouri, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. They kidnapped millionaires and held them in farmhouses and basements for ransom. And they did it with a level of organization that set them apart from the flashy gangs of the era. But history has a way of rewriting its villains. For decades, the story of the Barkers was told through the FBI's lens, J. Edgar Hoover's version. In that version, Ma Barker was the ruthless matriarch, a woman who plotted every robbery and pulled her son's strings from the shadows. It made for good headlines and great propaganda, a single woman leading men into crime, gunned down by heroic federal agents in a lakeside battle. The truth, however, was different. Every surviving member, every contemporary who knew her, even Karpis himself, said Ma Barker wasn't a mastermind. She was a mother who followed her sons from one safe house to another. She cooked for them, cleaned up after them, and lived off their crimes, but she didn't plan them. As Karpis once said, Ma couldn't plan breakfast, let alone a bank job. Her legend was born out of convenience. The Bureau needed a story, a moral victory to justify the bloodshed in Ocklawaha, Florida, and the image of a gun-wielding matron became that story. It stuck because it was simple, because America, in the depths of the Depression, wanted its monsters to have faces. Still, the Bremer Karpis Gang left real marks on history. Their crimes pushed law enforcement toward modernization. The FBI's fingerprint laboratory was tested and proven through the Ham and Bremer kidnappings, the first successful use of latent print recovery in American forensics. Their kidnappings helped shape federal kidnapping laws, giving the Bureau new authority to pursue fugitives across state lines. For Hoover, their downfall was the victory that solidified his power. For the public, it was the end of an era, the close of the outlaw age that had birthed names like Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, and Pretty Boy Floyd. And for Karpis, it was a lifetime sentence that outlasted everyone else. He became the only man ever to hold the title of Public Enemy No. 1 and live to tell the story. Today, the Barker Karpis name sits in the shadow of bigger legends, but their story remains a snapshot of a country caught between poverty and rebellion. A time when desperation blurred the line between survival and crime, and when a mother, her sons, and one cold-eyed planner built an empire from fear, bullets, and ransom money. It started in the dusty streets of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and ended in a quiet apartment in Spain. 40 years of blood, loyalty, and consequence, all written into one of the darkest chapters of America's criminal history.